I still have the footage. 12 minutes of grainy black and white video that I've watched more times than I can count. And every single time, I notice something new, something small, something in the corner of a frame I swear wasn't there before. My coworkers thought I was overreacting when I first reported it. Then they saw what the cameras caught on the night everything changed, and none of them ever worked alone again. My name is Daniel, and for a little over 3 years, I worked as the overnight security operator for a distribution warehouse on the industrial edge of Toledo, Ohio. If you've never seen one of these places at night, it's hard to describe how big it feels when it's empty. During the day, it's all noise and forklifts and shouting and the beeping of loading equipment, hundreds of people moving product through the building like blood through a body. But from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, it was just me, 42 security cameras, and about 300,000 square feet of dark concrete and steel shelving stacked 40 feet high. The job was simple on paper. I sat in a small windowless room we called the hub, a cramped office off the main floor lined with monitors, a coffee machine that never quite worked right, and a metal desk that somebody had carved their initials into decades ago. My whole world for 8 hours a night was that wall of screens. 42 feeds, cycling and static, showing every dock door, every aisle, every stairwell and break room and parking lot corner. I'd do a physical walk of the building twice a shift, once around 2 in the morning and once around 5, but the rest of the time I watched. That was the job. Watch and log anything unusual and call it in if something went wrong. For the first year, nothing ever went wrong. The most exciting thing that ever happened was a raccoon that got into the recycling dock and set off a motion alarm at 3 a.m. I remember laughing about it, actually relieved to have something to write in the log besides no incidents. The isolation didn't bother me the way it bothered some of the other guys who tried the shift and quit. I liked the quiet. I liked being alone with my thoughts and my podcasts and the low electric hum of all those monitors. I told myself the cameras were there to keep me safe, that as long as I could see every corner of the building on a screen, nothing could ever sneak up on me. That was my first mistake, because a camera only shows you what's inside the frame. It shows you the aisles, but not the space behind the shelving. It shows you the dock doors, but not the darkness on the other side of them. And it took me a long, long time to understand that the most dangerous things in that building always seemed to know exactly where the blind spots were. The night everything started, it was late October, and we'd had a shipment delay that left the whole east side of the warehouse packed floor to ceiling, with pallets that hadn't been sorted yet. That's an important detail, because those unsorted pallets created narrow canyons between the shelving units, corridors of stacked product that the cameras couldn't fully see into. I remember doing my 11 o'clock check of the feeds and noting how much darker that section looked than usual, all those boxes swallowing what little light the safety lamps threw down from the ceiling. Around midnight, I got up to refill my coffee, and when I sat back down, I noticed that the feed for camera 19 had gone to static. Camera 19 covered the far east loading dock, the one we barely used because it faced the empty lot and the tree line beyond the fence. A dead feed wasn't unusual by itself. The system was old, and cameras dropped out all the time, usually coming back on their own within a few minutes. I made a note in the log, Cam 19 static, 12:04 a.m., and went back to watching the others. But camera 19 didn't come back, and after about 10 minutes of staring at that gray, hissing rectangle, I started to get a feeling I hadn't had once in my entire time at that job. A cold, low feeling in my stomach, the kind your body gives you before your brain has caught up to why. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself the cold October air had probably knocked the connection loose, that I'd note it for the day crew and they'd fix it in the morning. Then, at 12:16 a.m., camera 19 flickered back to life, and there was a man standing on the loading dock. There was a man standing on the loading dock. He wasn't supposed to be there. The schedule for that night had no inbound deliveries after 10 p.m., and I'd watched the last truck pull away myself. The dock doors were all closed and secured. The alarm system was armed. The lot beyond the dock was empty, just cracked asphalt and the suggestion of trees in the distance. But there he was, center frame, like he'd been waiting for the camera to come back on. He stood facing the door, not moving, not knocking, just standing. The overhead dock light threw him into sharp relief. I could see that he wore some kind of dark work jacket, the kind mechanics wear, and loose jeans. His hands hung at his sides. His head was tilted slightly down, which struck me as odd, because people usually look up toward the door window if they're trying to see inside. His hair looked short, maybe a buzz cut, but the image quality made it hard to tell. At first, I thought he had to be one of our guys who'd gone outside to take a smoke break and gotten locked out. It happens sometimes, especially with new hires who didn't realize the doors automatically latched after a certain time. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Something about his posture nagged at me. He wasn't shifting his weight or fidgeting or rubbing his arms against the cold. He was just still. I reached for the phone beside my keyboard and punched in the internal extension for the night supervisor, a guy named Rick, who handled inventory. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. That was unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes Rick went out onto the floor and couldn't hear the phone over the forklifts. I tried his cell, straight to voicemail. Fine, I thought. I'd go check the dock myself, let the guy in, and chew him out later for not following protocol. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped my radio to my belt, and stepped out into the corridor. The warehouse felt different the moment I left the hub. I've tried to explain this to people who work day shifts, and they never quite get it. At night, a building that big doesn't feel like a place so much as a presence. The air has a weight to it. Small sounds carry in ways that don't make sense. What 6 aisles over can sound like it's right around the corner? I've always thought that once the day's noise dies, you finally notice how loud silence really is. My boots thudded on the concrete as I headed east, past the rows of sleeping forklifts and pallet jacks. The safety lights overhead cast cones of pale yellow along the main aisle, but the spaces between those cones were deep shadow. I remember thinking how much I wanted to get this over with and go back to my monitors, where the world was flat and contained and predictable. As I walked, I kept glancing at the small screen in my hand. The hub system mirrored feeds to a portable device, and camera 19 showed the man still standing there, unchanged. Same angle of his head, same slack arms, same stillness. The timestamp in the corner ticked along, 12:18, 12:19, 12:20. At 12:21, the image glitched for half a second, a horizontal line of static rolling down the frame. Then it snapped back. The man hadn't moved. The east dock was at the far end of the building, which meant I had to pass through the section with the unsorted pallets. I turned into that narrower aisle, and the difference hit me immediately. The space felt tighter, the ceiling lower, the light further away. Boxes towered on either side of me, some wrapped in plastic, others bare, labels facing whatever direction they'd landed when the day crew dropped them. The air smelled faintly of cardboard dust and machine oil. About halfway down that makeshift canyon, my radio crackled. Just a little burst of static, no voice. The kind of thing that happens when somebody else keys up on a channel nearby. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. No call signs, no chatter. The silence after the static felt louder than it should have. "Rick," I said, pressing my own transmit button. "You out on the floor?" My voice sounded small in the big space. No reply. I waited a few more seconds, then shrugged it off. Maybe he'd gone outside to the main lot to check something on a trailer. The radios sometimes lost range in certain pockets of the building. It wasn't a big deal. The dock door loomed ahead, a rectangle of dark metal with a small wired glass window at eye level. Inside the building, the dock lights were off. Company policy said we only turned them on during loading or unloading. On my portable screen, though, the outdoor floodlight was still beaming down, illuminating the man from camera 19's angle. When I reached the door, I did what I always do. I checked the window first. It's a habit every security person develops. You look through, make sure you recognize whoever's outside before you touch the handle. I stepped up, careful to keep my boots quiet, and peered through the glass. There was no one there. The dock looked exactly as it had earlier in the night. Empty slab of concrete, yellow painted safety railings, the lot beyond fading into shadows and the hint of trees. No man, no movement, no sign anyone had stood there, or paced, or smoked, or shifted from foot to foot. Just stillness. For a few seconds, my brain refused to accept it. I lifted the portable screen. On camera 19, the man was right there, center frame, floodlight painting his shoulders and the top of his head. On the other side of the glass, in reality, there was nothing. I backed away from the door, keeping my eyes on the window. My mouth had gone dry. You can convince yourself a lot of things are glitches when you work with old equipment, but seeing one version of reality on a screen and a different version through actual glass screws with you in ways you don't forget. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid, feeling like maybe I was missing something obvious. "Sir, if you're out there, you need to step into view. This area is under video surveillance." No answer, no movement. Somewhere deeper in the building, metal creaked as it settled. The sound made my shoulders tense. I looked at the screen again. For the first time, I noticed that the man's head was angled not toward the door, but slightly to the side, as if he were looking at something just out of the camera's field of view. His face was still in shadow, the brim of his brow hiding his eyes. It bothered me in a way I couldn't describe. "Okay," I muttered to myself, forcing my voice to sound steady. "Probably a sync issue. Maybe the recording is lagging live time." That was the only explanation that made any sense. Maybe camera 19 was a few minutes behind, showing me what had been outside instead of what was there now. I'd never seen a delay that long before, but the system was old. Old systems do strange things. I made a note on my device, tagged the feed for maintenance review, and started back toward the hub. As I turned away, something in the window caught my eye, a faint suggestion of movement. I stopped and slowly looked back. At first, I thought it was my own reflection. The window glass, wired and dirty, did a poor job of showing anything clearly, but I could see the faint shape of my shoulders, the vague outline of my head. It was what was behind that reflection that made my heart stutter. Far out in the parking lot, beyond where the floodlights reached, a darker patch of darkness seemed to be shifting, not moving toward the building, not moving away, just shifting, like a group of shapes changing places with each other. I stood there longer than I probably should have, staring at that barely there movement. Eventually, I convinced myself it was wind in the trees or a trick of my tired eyes. I headed back, chalking the entire thing up to equipment issues and bad lighting. I didn't know then that the footage was already recording, and that the delay I'd imagined wasn't a delay at all. It was something else, something worse. When I got back to the hub, I went straight to the console and pulled up camera 19 in full screen mode. The man was still there. 27 minutes had passed, according to the timestamp, and his posture remained exactly the same. No visible breathing, no shift of his shoulders, no movement of his hands. I leaned close, studying every pixel. The warehouse's cameras weren't high definition, but they were good enough to catch details, facial features, badges, logos on jackets. The resolution on this feed, though, seemed softer than it should have been. The edges of his figure blurred just a little into the background light, like the camera was having trouble differentiating him from the scene. "Who are you?" I said under my breath. The question felt stupid and necessary at the same time. I switched to the adjacent camera, number 20. which covered a wider angle of the same dock from higher up on the wall. On 20, the concrete was empty. No man, no vague blur of a body, just the dock, the railings, and darkness beyond. I flicked back and forth between the two feeds, 19 and 20. On 19, he existed. On 20, he didn't. Same time, same date, same place. One feed showed him. One feed didn't. You learn early in security work that your senses lie more than cameras do. People misremember. They miss things. They see what they expect instead of what's there. Cameras, though, cameras are supposed to be impartial. They record whatever is in front of them. That's what makes this story so hard to tell without sounding crazy. Because that night, the cameras didn't agree with each other. And that was only the beginning. I thought about calling the off-site supervisor, but it was nearly 1 a.m., and I could already imagine the conversation. Hey, I've got a camera that shows a guy who isn't there in reality. They tell me to reboot the system, to log it and move on. Besides, nobody was technically at risk. The building was locked. The lot was fenced. If someone really was out there, worst case, the police could check it out later. So I did what people do when something doesn't quite fit their understanding of the world. I minimized it. I told myself I was tired. I told myself this was a glitch. I noted it and moved on to other feeds. The next 30 minutes passed in that slow, syrupy way only night shift minutes do. I did my round of badge checks on the employee entrance cams, verifying that the one warehouse tech scheduled to stay late had clocked out and left. I glanced at the parking lot feeds, watched a stray cat skirt along the chain link fence, tail high, ghost in the sodium vapor light. Every few minutes, though, my eyes drifted back to 19. He didn't move. The timestamp marched on, indifferent. 0103, 0110, 0117. Around 1:20, something changed. It was small at first, so small I might have missed it if I hadn't been staring. The floodlight over the dock flickered. Not a full power loss, just a subtle pulse, like someone had dimmed it for half a second and brought it back. The man's shadow shortened and lengthened in time with the light, a black smear on concrete stretching toward the door, contracting, stretching again. I frowned. The building's maintenance schedule hadn't mentioned issues with exterior lights. I reached over and toggled the overlay that showed sensor data, temperature, motion alerts, door status. Everything read normal. No alarms, no anomalies. The system didn't even register that the light had flickered. The flickering continued, irregular, like someone tapping a dimmer switch at random. The man's outline reacted each time, losing definition for a heartbeat, then returning. I found myself leaning closer, almost nose to the screen. That was when the angle of his head began to change. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter on the feed, he started to look up. It wasn't dramatic. This wasn't some horror movie jump scare. His chin lifted a fraction, then another fraction, shadow shifting as if his focus were traveling up the plane of the dock door. I sat frozen, watching that movement unfold over several long minutes. When his head finally reached level, I realized what bothered me most. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking directly at the camera. I don't know how long we stared at each other, me through the screen, him from whatever distance separated his reality from mine. His face was still obscured, somehow, despite the light. I should have been able to make out eyes, nose, mouth, but the camera rendered his features as a soft, indistinct patch of gray. No highlight where his eyes reflected the light. No lines around his mouth. Just a blank suggestion of a human face. A human shape, looking straight into the lens. I pulled back, suddenly aware of how hard my heart was pounding. My fingers felt almost numb. The hubs overhead, fluorescent buzzed faintly, an old ballast making its presence known. Somewhere in the building, something clanged, metal on metal, echoing through the structure. Some higher, more rational part of my brain started flipping through possible explanations. Bad focus, dirty lens, compression artifacts from a stressed system. I'd seen all those things before, could picture examples from other nights. None of them quite matched what I was seeing now. I should have rebooted the camera then, should have shut it down and let the system reinitialize. Instead, I did something I still regret. I reached up and hit the record button. The system was always recording, of course, cycling through feeds and storing data by default. What the button did was flag a segment as important, preventing it from being overwritten in the normal purge cycle. At the time, I wasn't thinking about long-term consequences. I was thinking like an operator. Something strange was happening. I needed a record. The red indicator lit at the corner of the screen, timestamp and code 012407, segment flagged. On camera 19, the man did not react. His head remained level. His face remained indistinct. The light over the dock kept flickering in that slow, irregular pattern. I sat there, breathing shallow, every instinct telling me to look away and every other instinct telling me not to. The air in the hub felt stale, as if it hadn't been changed in hours. My coffee sat untouched, cooling in its chipped mug. Then, without any transition I could perceive, he was gone. One frame he stood there, shadow stretched across concrete. The next frame, the dock was empty. No blur of motion, no fade, just there, then not there. The floodlight steadied, its flickering abruptly over. I stared at the empty concrete for a long time, waiting for him to step back into frame. He didn't. The lot remained still. The tree line beyond remained a suggestion. On camera 20, nothing changed. It had never shown him at all. I don't remember making the decision to stand up, but I found myself on my feet, chair rolled back, hands planted on the desk. My legs felt unsteady. I looked down at my notebook where I'd been scribbling observations. The last thing I'd written was, head lifted, looking toward camera. Below that, my pen had dragged a shaky underline, stopping halfway, as if I'd moved my hand suddenly. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I told myself, again, that this had to be a system issue. Pixel drop, feed desync, something technical. I told myself, again, that the building was physically secure, that nothing had actually changed in the real world. It was a lie, but it was a useful one, for a while. You might be wondering why I'm spending so much time on this first incident, when the title of this story promises 7 true night shift horror stories. The reason is simple. This was the seed, the moment where reality and the cameras parted ways. Everything that came after, every story, grew from this. I didn't know it that night, but the footage I flagged at 1:24 a.m. would become the anchor, the piece of evidence we'd all circle back to whenever something else happened. It was the baseline weirdness. The first time the cameras caught what I couldn't see. The second time happened a week later, in a different building. At the warehouse, the days after that night were a blur of work and second guessing. I saved the segment, backed it up the way we were supposed to, and wrote a more detailed incident report than usual. The day supervisor, a woman named Carla, read it during the morning handoff, eyebrows knitting together as she skimmed my description of the man who was on one feed but missing in reality. "You're sure nobody was out there?" she asked, flipping through pages. Her tone was skeptical, but not dismissive. Carla had been in security for 15 years. She'd seen things. "I checked the dock physically," I said. "Twice. No footprints. No cigarette butts. Nothing disturbed. And camera 20 shows the same dock, different angle, with no one there." She glanced at the screen where I'd queued up the footage. For a moment, I watched her expression as she leaned in. It shifted from mild irritation to something closer to unease. "Run it back," she said. I scrubbed the feed to the point where the floodlight started flickering. We watched together as the man lifted his head over several long minutes, then met the camera's gaze. Carla frowned, nose wrinkling slightly. "Why's his face like that?" she muttered. "You cleaned the lens lately?" "2 days ago," I said. "Routine maintenance." We watched the moment where he vanished. There was no edit, no glitch, no blocky artifact suggesting missing frames. 1 second, he occupied space. The next second, he didn't. The light steadied. Carla crossed her arms. "Well," she said slowly, "I can't say I've ever seen anything like that." "So, what do we put in the report?" I asked. She sighed, long and tired. "Equipment anomaly," she said. "Note that the feed should be checked. Note that you physically inspected the area and found nothing. We both know that's what corporate will accept. And the footage, flagged and stored. If anything else happens on that dock, we can pull this to compare." She hesitated, then added, "And send me a copy." Her voice wasn't as steady on that last sentence. That was my first clue that whatever I'd seen, I wasn't alone in feeling that it was wrong. The day cruise tech guy, Devin, checked camera 19 that afternoon. He tested connections, examined the housing, cleaned the lens again. He found nothing wrong. He told me about it at the start of my next shift, shrugging like he wished he had a more satisfying answer. "Sometimes old systems do weird stuff," he said. "You get phantom frames, ghosting, motion after images. Could be a processing thing." "Have you ever seen feeds disagree like that?" I asked. "One showing a person, another showing empty space?" He paused. That pause was longer than I liked. "No," he admitted. "Not like that." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "You know they had someone die on that dock back in the early 2000s, right?" I didn't. The company was old. The building was older. Accidents happen. The way he said it, though, made the story feel less like trivia and more like context. "He was a forklift operator," Devin went on. "Got pinned between a trailer and the dock. They changed some safety protocols after. I wasn't here, but some of the older guys talk about it sometimes. It happened out by 19, I think." He tapped his pen against the desk, then looked at me. "You don't think?" I laughed, but it was a brittle sound. "Ghosts on camera?" I said. "Come on." We moved on. We had to. The world doesn't stop just because something strange happens on one of its many night shifts. A week later, I was covering a different site as a favor to Carla, an overnight at the medical complex on the west side of town, where the security system was newer, but the building had its own history. That was where the second story took shape. If you've never been in a hospital complex after midnight, it feels different than you might expect. People think of sirens and rushing staff and drama, but the truth is that most of the night is quiet corridors, the soft beep of monitors behind closed doors, and the low murmur of nurses at stations. In the older wing of the facility where I was assigned, the quiet had a heavier quality, as if time itself had slowed. My post was in a small room off the main service corridor, with 3 larger monitors showing camera grids and a fourth dedicated to entrance and exit logs. It was an easy assignment compared to the warehouse. Smaller footprint, fewer cameras, less to watch. The hospital paid for overnight security, mostly because of 2 things: the emergency department and the parking garages. People get upset in ER waiting rooms, and people do strange things in dark garages. My job was to keep an eye on both, respond to any alarms, and call in hospital staff if I saw something that needed intervention. It was just past 3 in the morning when I noticed something odd on the camera, monitoring the third-floor west wing, an older section used mostly for long-term recovery and some administrative offices. The feed showed a straight corridor with doors on either side, fluorescent lights humming above, linoleum floor reflecting the dull shine. At first glance, nothing was happening. The hallway was empty. But when I glanced again a minute later, I realized the lights weren't behaving the way they should. One fixture about halfway down the corridor flickered briefly, then steadied. I frowned. Flickering lights in a medical facility can mean maintenance issues, or they can mean something more urgent if they affect equipment. I watched, expecting maintenance staff to appear on camera after being called. Instead, the same light flickered again, longer this time. I checked the maintenance logs. No work order open for that floor. No alarms from equipment. The building's automated system showed, all clear. The light flickered a third time, then a fourth. The pattern wasn't regular. It felt more like communication. On, off, on, off. I leaned closer. That was when I noticed something else. On the floor, near that misbehaving light, the reflected glow seemed to stretch further than it should, as if pooling around something that wasn't there. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. Long shifts do that to you. Your mind starts seeing patterns and random noise. I told myself to take a drink of water, looked away for 30 seconds, then back again. The light had stopped flickering. The corridor looked normal. I glanced at another camera, then back. Normal. Empty hall, closed doors, silent. I almost dismissed it when a shadow moved. It wasn't big, just a darker smear near the edge of the frame, close to the floor, as if something low to the ground had slid out from under one of the doors and then back again. The movement was quick, but it left an impression in the reflected light, a distortion that lingered a heartbeat too long. My skin prickled. I switched to another camera, aimed at the same corridor from the opposite end. On that feed, the light did not flicker. The shadow did not move. The floor's reflection remained smooth and undisturbed. My heart rate ticked up, memory of camera 19 flashing uninvited into my mind. One feed saying something is here, another saying nothing is here. Both pointed at the same physical space. I toggled the record flag. For several minutes, nothing happened. I watched the West Wing camera like a hawk, eyes tracking every pixel. The lights held steady. The floor gleamed faintly. The doors stayed closed. Somewhere else in the hospital, an elevator dinged, distant on another feed. I was just about to unflag the segment when the motion sensor tied to that camera pinged. A soft chime announced, "Activity detected." On the screen, the corridor remained empty. The motion log showed a detection event at coordinates roughly where that misbehaving light had been. But to the human eye, nothing had changed. No person, no rolling cart, no door opening or closing. Just the sense, somewhere in the system, that something had moved. I paged the charge nurse for that floor, keeping my voice as neutral as I could. "Security here," I said. "I'm seeing some strange behavior on the West Wing third floor camera. Light flickering, motion alerts with no visible movement. Could someone check the corridor?" There was a pause. Then a tired voice replied, "We don't have any patients down that end tonight, but I'll send someone to look." On my monitor, the corridor remained still. Minutes ticked by. Then, a nurse appeared in frame, a woman in pale blue scrubs, hair pulled back, badge shining under the fluorescent. She walked down the hallway, glancing up at the lights, then around at the doors. She paused under the fixture that had flickered, squinting at it. On the adjacent camera, the same scene played out, two angles of the same nurse doing her routine check. Both feeds showed her clearly. Both showed the light steady. I relaxed a fraction. Then, on the first feed, the one tied to the motion sensor, the area around her feet darkened. I watched in disbelief as the reflected light on the floor seemed to retreat from her, like water pulling back before a wave. The boundaries of that retreat traced a shape around her shoes, a halo of shadow hugging her soles, climbing an inch up her ankles. She didn't react. She stood there, hands on hips, completely unaware that the camera depicted the light around her as bending away, leaving her in a kind of faint inverse glow. On the second feed, there was no such distortion. Her feet, her shoes, the floor, they all looked normal. My hand tightened around the radio. "You see anything weird with the lights?" I asked her, hearing the faint echo of my own voice through the corridor speakers. She looked up and down the hallway, then directly into the lens, brow furrowed. "No," she said. "Everything looks fine. Must be a sensor glitch." She turned to go. As she did, the shadow around her feet moved with her, trailing a half second behind, like something clingy but delayed. The motion sensor chimed again. Activity detected. My heart hammered against my ribs. I flipped quickly through other cameras, checking the elevator lobby, the stairwell, the patient rooms. Everything else looked normal. Normal nurses, normal lights, normal reflections. When I returned to the West Wing camera, the nurse was gone. The corridor was empty again. The motion sensor kept chiming. Quiet, insistent. The logs began to fill with entry after entry. Activity, activity, activity. All in a space where I could see no motion at all. I flagged the segment. Then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I changed the camera layout. We had the ability to overlay a faint outline representing the motion sensor's perceived shape onto the video feed. It was a diagnostic tool, rarely used. I enabled it. The screen flickered, then returned. The corridor flickered into view. The overlay appeared as a translucent white outline hugging a region of the floor where the light's reflection pooled. The outline was long, roughly human length, low to the ground. It was positioned in the center of the hallway, like someone were lying there. No body showed on the feed, no disturbance in reality, just the sensor's understanding of something that wasn't supposed to be there. My palms felt slick with sweat. I swallowed hard. That's when the outline moved. It stretched, slowly, like a person sitting up. The top end rose, forming something like shoulders, something like a head, though still nothing visible appeared on the actual video. The motion sensor traced it faithfully, an echo of shape without substance. The overlay showed a figure now, seated, facing the camera. On the adjacent feed, the corridor remained empty. I sat frozen, unable to look away, as the overlay figure turned, rotated toward one of the patient room doors, then toward the elevator lobby, then back again. The motion logs ticked up. Activity, activity, activity. Each entry punctuated by a quiet digital chime. I might have stayed rooted there indefinitely if a voice on my radio hadn't snapped me back. "Security, this is West Wing," the same nurse said. "We just had a temperature alarm trip in room 314. Equipment says there's a sudden drop, but the patient is stable. Could that be related to whatever you're seeing?" I checked the room camera. It showed a sleeping patient, breathing slow and steady, blanket rising and falling. The monitor beside the bed blinked green. The temperature readout on the overlay, though, showed a strange dip, 2 degrees down in under 30 seconds, with no environmental cause. "You're sure the HVAC is normal?" I asked. "Yes," she said. There was a hesitation. "It feels colder, though, just in that room. The hallway's fine." On the corridor camera, the sensor overlay began to drift, moving slowly toward the door labeled 314. As I watched, the outline stretched up to what would be standing height, then pressed itself toward the solid rectangle of the door. The motion logs chimed. Activity, activity. The door did not move. The handle did not turn. The video showed no difference at all. Only the sensor's ghost traced a path, slipping through where there should have been resistance. In the room camera, the patient shifted. His breath misted faintly in the air, even though that shouldn't have been visible at that temperature. His eyes opened, staring at some point near his feet. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. The monitor beeped again. Heart rate up. Temperature down. I swallowed against a dry throat. Can you stay with the patient? I asked the nurse. I'm going to log this. What am I logging? She asked, soft, uneasy. I looked at the screen where a sensor insisted something stood in that room, even as the camera insisted nothing did. The space between what the machines perceived and what our eyes saw felt like a precipice. I wrote anomaly. Corridor motion sensor suggests presence with no visible subject. Temperature drop in 314. Patient reports someone standing there, per nursing staff. Later, when I reviewed the audio recording from that room, I heard his voice clearly. It's cold, he whispered. He's back. That was the second story. The cameras caught what the staff couldn't see, or wouldn't see, or weren't ready to see. There were 5 more after that, each in different places, each on different nights, each tying back, in ways small and large, to that first moment on the dock. The third night I worked the medical complex, I got assigned to the parking garage post, and that's where the next thing happened. The garage was 6 levels of poured concrete, open on the sides so the wind moved through it in long, low moans. 12 cameras covered the whole structure, 1 per ramp and 2 per level, feeding back to a booth near the ground floor exit. By 3 in the morning, the garage was nearly empty, just a scattering of night staff cars and 1 delivery van parked crooked across 2 spaces on level 4. I noticed the van because it hadn't been there during my earlier sweep of the feeds. No entry log showed it passing the gate. The arm at the entrance only lifted for scanned badges or ticketed vehicles, and the camera on that arm had recorded nothing for over an hour. Yet there the van sat, headlights off, parked at an angle no careful driver would choose. I zoomed in. The windshield was dark, tinted or fogged, I couldn't tell. No plate visible from that angle, no company logo, just a plain white panel van, the kind you stop noticing on any street until it's the only thing in an empty garage at 3 in the morning. I switched to the ramp camera between levels 3 and 4, the one every vehicle had to pass to reach that spot. I scrubbed the recording back an hour. The ramp stayed empty the entire time. No van, no headlights. Nothing came up or went down. The van simply existed on level 4 without ever having arrived. I felt that cold, low feeling again, the same one from the loading dock. I picked up the radio and called it in to the on-site facilities officer, asked him to walk up and check the plate. He grumbled about the climb, but agreed. I watched his camera-to-camera progress, ground floor to level 1, 1 to 2, the small figure of him trudging up the ramps with his flashlight bobbing. When he reached the level 4 camera, he stepped into frame, walked toward the van's parking spot, and stopped. There's nothing here, he said over the radio. On my monitor, the van sat 3 feet from where he stood. It's right in front of you, I said. White van, parked across 2 spaces. He turned a slow circle, flashlight sweeping empty concrete. Daniel, I'm telling you, this level is empty. Whole thing. There's no van. I stared at the feed. The van, the officer, both in frame. He walked directly through the space the van occupied on my screen, flashlight passing across it, his body overlapping the image of the vehicle as if it were made of nothing. And as he passed through it, the van's dark windshield changed. For a single frame, the fog cleared, and a face pressed against the glass from the inside, staring out at the officer's back, pale, mouth open, eyes fixed and wide. Then he stepped clear, and the windshield fogged over again, and the van sat there, patient, waiting for a driver who would never come. That was the third story. The camera caught a vehicle that had never entered, holding a passenger no one could see. The fourth story didn't happen at the hospital or the warehouse. It happened at a self-storage facility out near the highway, a place I picked up for extra pay during a stretch when I needed the money. Self-storage at night is its own kind of lonely. Long rows of orange roll-up doors, motion lights that snap on and off as you drive the lanes, and a small office with a bank of monitors covering maybe 30 cameras spread across the property. Most nights, the only activity was raccoons and the occasional customer who'd forgotten something and came by at an hour no reasonable person keeps. It was a little after 2 in the morning when Unit B114 lit up on my board. Each unit had a simple door sensor, not a camera inside, just a contact that told the system whether the door was open or closed. B114's sensor showed open, but the aisle camera covering that row showed every door in the row sealed shut, including B114. Orange metal, closed tight, padlock hanging from the latch. I refreshed the sensor data, still open. I looked at the camera again, still closed. The two systems disagreed, the same way the warehouse feeds had disagreed, the same way the hospital corridor had. I zoomed the aisle camera on B114. The padlock was there, the door was down, and yet, along the bottom edge of that door, where it met the concrete, a thin line of darkness seemed deeper than the shadow under the neighboring units. Not light spilling out, the opposite. Darkness spilling in, like the gap under the door led somewhere the aisle's motion lights couldn't reach. I did what I'd learned to do by then. I flagged the segment and I kept watching instead of walking out there alone. For a long time, nothing moved. Then the motion light above B114 clicked on, all by itself. No one in the aisle, no car, no animal. The light simply triggered, throwing hard white glare down the row, and in that glare the shadow under B114's door pulled back, thinning, as though whatever cast it had stepped away from the gap. The sensor flipped to closed. Then, 3 seconds later, back to open. Then closed. Then open. Faster and faster, the little indicator on my board blinking like a heartbeat racing, while on the camera the door itself never moved a single inch. The padlock hung still. The metal stayed down. But something on the other side of that closed door was opening and closing it, over and over, in a space the camera swore was sealed. I called the property manager the next morning and asked, as casually as I could, who rented B114. There was a pause on the line. Nobody, he said. B114's been empty for 2 years. We had a customer pass away, family never claimed it. We cleared it out ourselves. There's nothing in there but a light bulb and concrete. I asked him to open it and check. He called me back an hour later and his voice had changed. The padlock's still ours, he said slowly. Company lock, company key. But when I opened it up, he stopped. What? I asked. The floor's wet, he said. In a rectangle, right in the middle, like something had been sitting there. And the walls. He stopped again. There's marks on the inside of the door. Scratches. Long ones. Going down. Like somebody was trying to get out. That was the 4th story. The sensor caught something moving in a room that had been empty for 2 years, behind a door that never opened. The 5th story took me back to the warehouse, to a night in December when a snowstorm had shut down most of the roads, and I was the only living soul for what felt like miles. The storm knocked out half our exterior cameras with ice on the lenses, so I was working with a thinned-out board, maybe 20 feeds instead of 42. The wind pushed against the building all night, a low, constant pressure that made the metal walls tick and groan. Around 3 in the morning, camera 7, the one covering the main interior aisle, showed the long central corridor of the warehouse, stretching away into darkness, safety lights throwing their cones down the length of it. At the far end of that aisle, just at the edge of where the light gave out, something was standing. It was too far away to make out clearly, just a vertical smudge against the black. I told myself it was a pallet stacked wrong, or a coat someone had left draped over a rack. I switched to camera 8. the one that covered the far end of the same aisle from the opposite direction. Camera 8 showed the aisle empty, no smudge, no shape. Back to 7. The shape was still there, and it was closer, not by much, just one safety light cone nearer than before, which meant it had covered maybe 40 feet without me seeing it move. I hadn't looked away for more than a few seconds. On camera 7, it advanced. On camera 8, it didn't exist. I flagged the segment and I stayed in my chair, because by then I understood the rule of that building. Whatever the cameras caught that I couldn't see, I did not go out to meet it. Every time I glanced at camera 7, the shape was one cone closer. Never while I watched, only in the gaps between my glances. Cone by cone, aisle light by aisle light, it came up the center of the warehouse toward the hub, and camera 8, pointed at the very same floor, showed nothing but empty concrete the entire time. When it reached the last safety light, before the corridor that led to my room, I could finally make out what it was. It was the man from the loading dock. Same dark work jacket, same loose jeans, same buzzed head, tilted slightly down, and the same blank, indistinct patch where his face should have been, gray and featureless under a light that should have shown me everything. He stopped at the edge of camera 7's view, right where the aisle met the corridor to the hub, and he lifted his head, and he looked into the lens. Then camera 7 went to static. I sat very still, listening. The wind pressed on the walls. The fluorescent above me buzzed, and somewhere down the corridor outside my door, on the concrete I could not see on any working camera, I heard a single, slow footstep. Then nothing. The storm howled. Camera 7 came back on. The aisle was empty, all the way to the far end. Whatever had walked up, it was gone, or was standing in the one place no lens covered, the stretch of hallway right outside the hub. I did not open that door until the sun came up. The sixth story is the one my coworkers finally believed, because it didn't happen to me. It happened to Marcus, the guy who took over the warehouse hub on my nights off, a heavy-set ex-army guy who didn't spook at anything and who'd rolled his eyes every single time I tried to tell him about the man on the dock. He called me at 4 in the morning. I'd never heard Marcus's voice do what it was doing on that phone. It was thin, it was small. "Daniel," he said, "the cameras. There's a guy on the dock, camera 19, but when I go look, there's nobody there." I sat up in bed, wide awake. "Don't go out there," I said. "Whatever you do, stay in the hub. Flag it and stay in your chair." "I already went out," he said. "First time it came up, I went to check. Nothing on the dock, but when I came back to the hub," he stopped. I heard him breathing. "Daniel, while I was gone, the camera in the hub recorded me leaving, and then it recorded somebody else sitting down in my chair, facing the monitors, for the whole time I was walking the floor. And when I came back into the room, the footage shows him standing up and walking out of frame right as I opened the door." "Marcus," I said carefully, "where are you right now?" "In the hub," he whispered, "in my chair, and I can smell diesel and cold air, like somebody just came in from outside." And camera 19, his voice cracked. "He's not on the dock anymore. He's not on any of the outside cameras. He's on camera 3. That's the corridor. That's right outside this door." I told him to lock the door. I told him not to look at the window. I stayed on the phone with him for the longest 20 minutes of my life, listening to him breathe, listening to the silence stretch, until the day crew arrived and the sun came up and the man on camera 3 was simply, finally, gone. Marcus never worked a night shift alone again. None of us did after that, because that was the sixth story, and it was the one that proved it wasn't me. The cameras caught what none of us could see, and they caught it whether I was in the chair or not. The seventh story is the one that finally connects everything, because it's the one where I stopped watching the cameras and started reading the old records instead. After Marcus's night, the building brought in a facilities historian, an insurance requirement more than anything, someone to document the property before corporate decided whether to renovate or demolish the east wing entirely. I asked to sit in on the walkthrough. Carla pulled some strings to let me. The historian was an older woman named Ruth, sharp-eyed, unbothered by the cold, carrying a folder thick with photocopies. She walked us straight to the east dock, to camera 19's little rectangle of concrete, and she didn't hesitate. "This is where Gerald Hobbs died," she said. "March 2003. Forklift operator, 26 years old. Pinned between a reversing trailer and the dock wall. Took the crew almost 11 minutes to get the trailer moved and pull him free. He was still breathing when the ambulance left. Didn't survive the ride to the hospital." I felt the cold feeling settle into my chest again, the same one from that first night. 11 minutes, I repeated. "Give or take," Ruth said. "There was no working camera on this dock back then, not until the system was upgraded in 2009. Camera 19 was one of the first installed in this section." "Why here?" I asked. "Why did they put a camera on a dock they barely use?" Ruth glanced at the file. "Because after Hobbs died, the family sued for negligence, claimed the company hadn't properly documented safety conditions. Company settled, and part of the agreement was full video coverage of every loading area on the property, permanently, indefinitely. 19 was installed specifically because of what happened here." 9 quote. "I thought about the man on the dock, the way he'd stood in exactly that spot, unmoving, for 27 minutes on the night everything started. I thought about his face, blank and indistinct, no matter how close I zoomed, no matter how clean the lens. I thought about the reversing trailer that had never been there, the 11 minutes it had apparently taken a crew that no longer existed to free a man who'd already been gone for over 20 years. He wasn't looking at the door," I said slowly. "He was waiting." Ruth looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not disbelief, something closer to recognition. "Waiting for what?" "For someone to move the trailer," I said. "Nobody ever has." We stood there a long moment, the wind cutting across the empty lot beyond the dock, the floodlights steady overhead, no flicker, no static, nothing but ordinary daylight glare on ordinary concrete. Ruth wrote something in her folder and didn't ask me to explain further. I think she'd heard enough stories from enough buildings to know better than to ask for proof of things that only make sense at 2 in the morning. I want to tell you the story ends there, tidy and explained, but it doesn't. Because 2 nights later, back in the hub, alone again because staffing never really changes, no matter how many people quietly ask not to work nights anymore, I pulled up the original 12 minutes of footage from that very first night, the flagged segment, the one I'd watched more times than I could count. I watched it once more, from the beginning, the floodlight steady, the man appearing in frame, his head lowered, exactly as it always was. I watched the flickering start at 1:20, watched his head lift by degrees, watched him turn to look directly into the lens, the way he always did. Except this time, when his head leveled and his blank gray face pointed at the camera, his mouth moved. It hadn't done that before. Not in 3 years of rewatching, not once. I leaned in, heart hammering, and turned the audio up, though the feed had never carried sound, though there had never been a microphone on that dock at all. The speakers hissed with silence, empty static, the ordinary nothing of an unpowered channel. And underneath that static, so quiet I might have imagined it, I heard a voice say 2 words, "Move it." The footage cut to black, exactly where it always had, at the 12-minute mark, timestamp 1:36:07. I sat in that chair for a long time afterward, the fluorescent buzzing overhead, my coffee gone cold in its chipped mug, And I thought about a man who'd spent more than 20 years standing in the one place his death had happened, asking, in the only way he had left, for somebody to please, finally, move the trailer. I don't work nights anymore. None of us who were there for those months do. The warehouse eventually demolished that section of the east dock during a renovation the following spring, tore out the old concrete pad entirely, and rebuilt it 30 feet further down the wall. Camera 19 was decommissioned. I asked Devin what happened to the footage archive, and he told me corporate ordered it wiped as part of a routine data policy update. All of it. Gone, except for the one segment I'd personally backed up onto a drive I never turned in. I still have it. 12 minutes of grainy black and white video that I've watched more times than I can count. And I know, now, exactly what I'm looking for every time I press play. Not a glitch, not a compression error. Just a man waiting in the one place a camera happened to be pointed the night his life ended, still asking, all these years later, for somebody to move the trailer so he can finally stop standing there in the cold. None of the buildings I worked in afterward gave me trouble like that first warehouse did, but I still don't fully trust a security feed that shows me an empty room, because I've learned, the hard way, that sometimes the cameras aren't malfunctioning at all. Sometimes they're the only thing in the building actually telling you the truth. Let me go back to that first night, because I don't think I gave you the full picture of what it felt like to sit in that hub for the hours after the man disappeared from the dock. After I flagged the segment and watched him vanish from camera 19, I didn't just sit there frozen. I did what any operator is trained to do. I ran the checklist. I confirmed the building's perimeter alarms were still armed. I confirmed the fire suppression system read normal. I confirmed every door sensor on my board showed green, sealed, secure. Everything, on paper, said the building was exactly as safe as it had been at 11 o'clock when my shift started. But paper doesn't account for the way a room feels different once you know something has been looking back at you through a lens. I remember getting up from my chair sometime around 2 in the morning, unable to sit still any longer, and pacing the small footprint of the hub. 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. The walls of that room had always felt close, but that night they felt like they were pressing in a little, like the whole structure had shrunk half an inch around me. I kept glancing at the monitors, half expecting to see the man reappear somewhere else on the board, and half dreading it more than anything I'd felt in years. At 2:40 a.m., I decided to call Rick again, more out of a need to hear another human voice than any real expectation he'd answer. This time he picked up on the second ring, voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," he said. "What's up?" "You didn't answer earlier," I said. "Around midnight." There was a pause, the sound of him shifting, maybe sitting up. "I was in the break room," he said slowly, "fixing the ice machine." "Why?" "I called your desk phone and your cell," I said. "Both went to voicemail." "My cell's been in my truck all night," he said. "I left it in the cup holder. Didn't want it going off while I was elbow deep in that machine." That should have been a relief. Instead, it made something in my chest tighten further, because if Rick hadn't been near his phone and hadn't been near a radio, then for that entire stretch of time, when the man was standing on the dock, I really had been the only person conscious in that building who could have responded to anything. "Everything okay?" Rick asked, hearing something in my silence. I almost told him. I got as far as opening my mouth. Then I thought about how it would sound, a grown man describing a figure that existed on one screen and not another, a face that wouldn't resolve no matter how close he zoomed, a floodlight that flickered in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. I thought about how Rick, decent as he was, would probably laugh it off as fatigue or a trick of the old cameras, and some tired, defensive part of me didn't want to hand him that laugh. "Nah," I said instead. "Just a weird glitch on 19. Wanted to make sure nobody was actually out there." "Systems held together with duct tape and prayers," Rick said, yawning audibly. "Wouldn't put anything past it. You good to finish the shift?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm good." I wasn't, But there wasn't anything productive in saying so at 3 in the morning to a man half asleep on the other end of a phone line. After we hung up, I made a fresh pot of coffee I didn't actually want, more for the ritual of it than the caffeine, and I sat back down in front of the monitors. I want to describe what the next 4 hours felt like, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. You'd think, after seeing something like that, the natural instinct would be dread, a kind of held breath anticipation of the next horror. And there was some of that, but there was also something stranger underneath it, a compulsion I didn't expect. I found myself watching camera 19 more than any other feed, not out of duty, but out of something closer to curiosity, the same pull that makes people slow down at accident scenes. Some deep, unhelpful part of my brain wanted him to come back, wanted to see what he'd do next, wanted to understand. He didn't come back that night. The dock stayed empty, the floodlight steady, no flicker, no static, nothing but ordinary stillness, until the sky outside started turning that particular shade of gray. That means morning is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. When Carla arrived for the day shift, I was still sitting in the same chair, coffee cold, eyes raw from staring at screens for 8 straight hours without blinking as much as I should have. She took one look at me and said, "You look like you saw a ghost." And I remember laughing at that, a short, ugly laugh that surprised both of us. "Something like that," I said. I told her everything then, start to finish, the flicker, the head lifting, the face that wouldn't resolve, the disappearance with no fade, no transition, just there, and then not there. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated more than I could say at the time, and when I finished, she didn't laugh, and she didn't tell me I was imagining things. She asked to see the footage. We watched it together in the cramped hub, both of us leaning toward the same small monitor, and I watched her face while she watched the screen. I saw the moment her expression changed, right around the point where his head reached level and his eyes, or the blank space where eyes should have been, met the lens directly. Her jaw tightened, her arms crossed over her chest, a gesture I'd come to recognize over the following months as her specific tell for approaching something she didn't want to approach. "Play it again," she said. I did, twice more. Each time, she watched with the same still intensity, and each time, at the exact same frame, her breath caught, just slightly, just enough that I noticed. "You checked the physical dock," she said finally. It wasn't really a question. "Twice," I said. "Nothing there. No footprints, no marks, nothing disturbed. And camera 20 never showed anything." "Never," I said. "Same time window, completely different footage. Empty the whole way through." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the frozen frame of the empty dock where he'd once stood, floodlight steady, concrete bare. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. "You know," she said slowly, "cameras aren't supposed to lie. That's the whole point of them. You put a camera somewhere because you don't trust your own eyes, or you don't trust the person you're watching, or you just need something that doesn't blink, doesn't get tired, doesn't imagine things. The entire reason this job exists is because a lens is supposed to be more honest than a person." "So what does it mean," I asked, "when the lens shows you something that isn't there?" She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. Not for a long time. It wasn't until Ruth the historian laid out the story of Gerald Hobbs, of the 11 minutes it took to move that trailer, of the settlement that put a camera on that exact stretch of concrete, specifically because nobody had been watching when he died, that the shape of an answer started to form. But that understanding was still weeks away from that gray morning in the hub, and for now, all Carla and I had was a frozen frame, a folder marked Equipment Anomaly that neither of us fully believed, and the growing, unshakable sense that something in that building had been waiting a very long time for somebody, anybody, to finally see it. "I'll keep going, and expand the second story next, adding the parts of the hospital shift I compressed the first time through, the wider context of that facility's own history, more of my exchanges with the nurse, and the aftermath the hospital staff dealt with once the temperature anomaly in room 314 was logged officially. Continuing now, the hospital complex, I should say, had its own quiet reputation among the security staff who rotated through it, something I didn't learn until after that night with the flickering light and the sensor that traced a shape no camera could confirm. The West Wing, where it happened, was the oldest surviving structure on the property, built in the 1960s and repeatedly renovated around rather than replaced, the kind of architectural patchwork you find in institutions old enough to have outlived several generations of administrators. Most of that wing had been converted to long-term recovery and administrative offices decades ago, after a fire in the original psychiatric ward forced the hospital to shut down and later repurpose the entire floor. I didn't know about the fire that first night. I learned about it 3 days later, when I mentioned the incident, carefully, vaguely, to another security contractor who covered the day rotation at the same facility, a heavy-set man named Tobias, who'd worked hospital security for almost 20 years. "Third floor west," he said, when I described the corridor, the flickering light, the motion sensor's ghost outline. He didn't ask any clarifying questions. He just nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he already suspected. "There was a fire back in '78, he said. "Whole ward went up. Faulty wiring, they said, though I've heard different stories depending who's telling it. 6 patients died, all of them on that same corridor, in rooms strung along that same hallway." "Which room?" I asked, though some part of me already knew before he answered. "314 was one of them," Tobias said. "Older guy. Been there years by that point. They never fully renovated that section, just patched the walls, repainted, moved on. Hospitals don't like talking about that stuff. Bad for reputation." I told him about the temperature drop, the patient's whispered words, the sensor tracing a shape that sat up and turned toward the door. Tobias listened with the calm of a man who'd heard variations of this story more times than he wanted to count. "You want my honest opinion," he said. "I think some buildings remember things. Not haunted in the movie sense. Not chains rattling, doors slamming. Just residue. Something that gets recorded into the place itself, and every once in a while, the right combination of cold and quiet and machinery lets it surface again." I didn't know what to do with that theory then, and I'm not sure I fully know what to do with it now. But it stuck with me because it was the first time anyone had offered something resembling an explanation instead of dismissal, and because it matched, uncomfortably well, what I'd already started to suspect about Camera 19 and the man who died on that dock. I checked on that patient in room 314 a few more times over the following weeks, through the hospital's own internal system rather than anything I had direct access to, just curious how he was doing, half out of concern and half out of a need to understand what had actually happened to him that night. The charge nurse told me he'd been discharged about 10 days later, physically recovered, though she mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd refused to be assigned to that particular room again during a brief readmission a month afterward. Wouldn't say why, she told me, just kept saying he didn't want to go back to 314. Family thought maybe he associated it with feeling sick. We didn't push. I never got the chance to ask him directly what he saw or felt or heard that night. Cold air pooling around him, while a shape with no visible source traced itself across the corridor outside his door. Part of me was relieved not to have that conversation. Some things I've learned are easier to document than to hear firsthand from the person who lived them. I never fully explained what happened after that night, after the facilities officer walked through the van that wasn't there, and I saw that face pressed against the fogged windshield for a single frame. I filed the report the same way I'd filed the loading dock incident, marked as an equipment anomaly, flagged for review, quietly backed up onto my own drive because some instinct told me the official copy wouldn't survive long in the system. The facilities officer, whose name was Ellis, didn't want to talk about it afterward. He was a practical man, ex-mechanic, the kind of guy who fixed problems with his hands and didn't have much patience for things he couldn't explain with a wrench. When I tried to bring it up during the next overlap in our shifts, he cut me off almost immediately. I walked through that whole level, he said, twice. There was nothing there. Whatever your camera caught, it wasn't in that garage. Not in any way that matters to me. But you saw the footage, I said. The van, the face in the windshield. I saw pixels, Ellis said. Old system, cheap sensors, garbage light at 3 in the morning. I'm not saying you're lying about what you saw on a screen. I'm saying I'm not going to lose sleep over pixels. I understood his position, even respected it in a strange way. Not everyone needs to carry the weight of an unexplained thing. Some people are built to let it go, to categorize it as noise and move forward. And I've come to think that's a kind of survival skill I never quite managed to develop myself. I ran a record search a few weeks later, out of the same compulsion that had driven me to sit with Ruth through the loading dock history. Vehicle theft, garage-related incidents, anything tied to that specific level of that specific structure. Most of what I found was mundane. Fender benders, a stolen catalytic converter. One report of vandalism from years back, but buried in an older file from before the hospital's current ownership took over the property was a single incident from the 1990s, a missing persons report filed by a family whose relative had driven to the hospital for a late-night visit and never returned to his car. His vehicle, a white panel van used for his contracting business, was found abandoned on level 4 3 days later, engine cold, doors locked, no sign of forced entry, no sign of him. He was never found. The case, as far as I could tell from the fragments available to me, went cold within the year. I don't know if the van on my screen that night was his van. I don't know if the face in the windshield belonged to him or to someone else entirely, some echo layered onto the same physical space by 3 decades of nights nobody was watching closely enough. But I know I never worked that parking garage post again after learning about that file, and I know Ellis, for all his practical dismissal, started parking his own truck closer to the exit gate after that night, a small habit change he never explained and I never asked him to. When the property manager opened B114 the next morning and told me about the wet rectangle on the floor and the scratch marks inside the door, I asked him one more question I probably shouldn't have asked. What had been in the unit before the tenant died? He went quiet for a second, and I could hear papers shuffling on his end of the phone, the sound of somebody deciding how much they really wanted to know the answer to their own records. Then he said it had mostly been furniture, a mattress, some boxes of clothes, holiday decorations, normal things. But there had also been an industrial freezer chest, the kind people keep in basements or garages, and when the family failed to claim the unit and the company finally cut the lock, they found that chest unplugged in the middle of summer, lid closed, water all over the concrete underneath. He laughed when he told me that part, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind people make when they're standing too close to something uncomfortable and want to signal to themselves that it's ordinary. I asked if the chest had still been there when he opened B114 that morning. No, he said. It had been hauled off years ago. Then why is the floor wet again? I asked. He didn't answer that. A few days later, he told me he'd moved all the paper records for dead or delinquent units out of the office and into a back closet because he didn't like seeing B114 on the occupancy chart every morning when he came in. The system still listed it as vacant, but he swore that every once in a while, usually on nights after rain, the line beside that unit number would briefly flick from gray to green on the old board in the office, as if somebody had just keyed in and opened it after hours. He started checking the live feed from home after that, just to reassure himself, he said. But after about 2 weeks, he stopped, and when I asked why, he told me the camera kept showing the same thing just before dawn. The row would be empty, the motion light would trigger, and for one frame only, right at the edge of the unit door, there would be the curved white suggestion of fingers hooked under the metal from the inside, like somebody testing to see if the roll-up could be lifted. That was when I finally understood that some places don't just hold memories of what happened there. Some places keep repeating the same unfinished moment over and over, trying to complete it with whoever happens to be watching. And maybe that's why the fifth story bothered me more than any of the others, because it was the first time I got the sense that whatever the cameras were showing wasn't just replaying itself. It was learning the shape of the building, learning the routes we used, learning maybe where to stand if it wanted to be close. That snowstorm in December had turned the whole warehouse into a sealed metal world. I got there just before 11, headlights catching thick sheets of snow blowing sideways across the lot, and by midnight, most of the exterior cameras had halos of ice on the lenses that made the world outside look smeared and underwater. The shipping office had closed early. Day staff had all gone home before the county started talking about road closures. By 1 in the morning, I was the only person left in that building with any reason to believe the rest of the world still existed beyond the loading bays. People who don't work nights imagine solitude as calm. Sometimes it is. But sometimes, once the weather gets bad enough and the roads disappear and the windows become mirrors, solitude changes into something else. It starts to feel less like privacy and more like exposure, like being the only warm thing moving inside the shell of something much larger and older than you. I was doing what I always did when I wanted to push back that feeling, rotating the feeds, checking doors, writing small, pointless notes in the log so the shift would feel divided into manageable pieces. At 2:53 a.m., I wrote, West perimeter cams obscured by ice. At 3:02, I wrote, Dock 6 motion alert false, likely weather. At 3:11, I stopped writing, because that was when I saw the shape at the end of the main aisle. What made it worse wasn't just that camera 7 showed it and camera 8 didn't. It was the pace of it, the impossibly patient way it advanced. If it had rushed me, if it had sprinted through the cones of yellow safety light like an intruder trying to be seen, I think some part of me could have classified it as danger and responded the way people respond to danger. But it didn't do that. It let me watch the empty aisle on one camera while, on the other, it moved one section closer every time I looked away. I started timing myself at one point. 3 seconds on camera 8. Nothing there. Back to 7. One cone closer. 4 seconds on 8. Empty. Back to 7. Closer again. The mind doesn't have a ready-made place to put that kind of contradiction. It keeps trying to force the facts into familiar containers. A technical fault, a delayed feed, stress, fatigue. But the problem with old systems is that when they fail messily. You get tearing, lag, blocky images, obvious artifacts. What I had that night was too clean, too deliberate. One camera seeing a truth the other couldn't. When the shape was finally near enough that I could distinguish the jacket, the jeans, the tilt of the head, something in me gave up on explanation. Not gave up on survival, exactly. Just gave up on the idea that there was a normal answer somewhere in the next few minutes if only I stayed calm enough to find it. I muted every other feed. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if something happened, I needed to hear the building. Maybe I didn't want another meaningless motion alert or static burst overlapping whatever came next. The hub fell into a deeper silence, just the hum of the monitors and the low mechanical breath of the ventilation system. Then the man reached the edge of the corridor outside my room, and camera 7 died in static. The footstep I heard after that wasn't loud. That was the worst part. It was ordinary. A weight settling on concrete somewhere just beyond the door, the kind of sound I'd heard 1,000 times from tired warehouse boots during daytime rounds. If it had scraped or pounded or done anything dramatic, I might have been able to separate it from the rest of reality. But it sounded like a person stopping outside a closed office because they needed something from whoever was inside. I remember staring at the door handle, remember thinking, with a kind of detached clarity, that if it turned even a fraction, I'd probably stop having any coherent thoughts at all. I had my radio in one hand, thumb over the transmit button, but I didn't call out, didn't ask who was there, didn't ask what they wanted. The idea of hearing a reply from the other side of that door felt worse than silence. I sat that way for maybe 20 minutes, maybe 40. Time had gone strange. The storm pushed against the walls. Once, I thought I heard a soft drag across the concrete outside, as if somebody had shifted 1 foot back half an inch. Then nothing until sunrise began to color the narrow upper windows at the far end of the building, and the ordinary world slowly reassembled itself around me. When I finally opened the hub door, the corridor was empty, but on the concrete just outside, leading away from the threshold, and then stopping after 4 steps, was a thin scatter of dirty meltwater in the shape of footprints. Not boot tread, not clear enough for that. Just dark, wet impressions drying fast in the stale indoor air, like someone had come in from the snow and stood there waiting long enough for the ice on their shoes to melt. I showed Carla when she came in. She crouched, touched one of the marks, then looked at me without saying much. Neither of us mentioned that the snow outside had frozen hard overnight, and nobody had entered the building after the last day shift worker left. Neither of us mentioned that the only exterior dock associated with the man we'd both seen on video was on the opposite side of the warehouse. We didn't need to. Marcus was supposed to cover my next night off 2 days later, and I almost warned him not to take the shift. But I didn't, partly because I still wasn't sure how to say any of this without sounding unstable, and partly because some selfish part of me wanted confirmation that I wasn't the only one this was happening to. I hated that part of myself when I realized it was there, but it was there all the same. Marcus had the kind of confidence some people are lucky enough to carry without even trying. Big shoulders, close-cropped beard, voice that always seemed one notch louder than the room required. He'd done convoy security overseas, worked corrections for a while, and came into warehouse work with the air of a man who had already seen the worst people could do and had no intention of being impressed by forklifts and night alarms. The first time I brought up camera 19 around him, he grinned and said, "So you've got a ghost with a time card. Good. Maybe he can cover your lunch." Even when Carla backed me up enough to say the feed had shown something she couldn't explain, Marcus just shrugged. "Old building," he said. "You start enough night shifts in old buildings, your brain fills in blanks. Happens to everybody." Maybe that's why his phone call hit me so hard, because Marcus wasn't predisposed to fear. If anything, he treated fear like a personal insult. So hearing it in his voice at 4 in the morning, thin and strangled, and trying its best not to become panic, did more to convince me than any footage ever had. He told me later, in a fuller account than the fragments he got out over the call, that it started almost exactly the way it had for me. Camera 19 dropping to static, then returning with the man on the dock. Marcus had laughed at first, said out loud to the empty hub, "There he is, Daniel's union rep." Then he went to check the door. Empty dock, no one there. What changed things for him wasn't just that he came back to the room and found the hub footage showing somebody else seated in his chair while he was gone. It was what that seated figure was doing. It wasn't just facing the monitors. It was leaning forward slightly, one hand braced on the desk, as if studying the feeds the same way we did, as if trying to understand the building from the operator's point of view. Marcus said he watched the playback 3 times before he could make himself believe it was really him on one side of the screen and someone else occupying his place on the other. The figure's head never fully turned toward the hub camera, but once, just once, in the reflection of the dark monitor glass, Marcus caught the gray blur of a face where features should have been. And when the footage showed the figure stand up moments before the real Marcus opened the door, he saw something else too. The chair beneath it was wet, not soaked, just damp enough to darken the seat fabric in a shape that matched a seated body. That's why, when he called me and whispered that he could smell diesel and cold air, I believed him immediately. Because Gerald Hobbs hadn't just died on the dock. He died pinned against cold metal while a trailer idled. Diesel and winter and waiting were the whole atmosphere of his last 11 minutes. If the building remembered him, maybe it remembered him that way. Marcus lasted another week on nights before transferring to a daytime logistics role. Officially, it was because of family scheduling. Unofficially, he told me over beers one Friday that he couldn't sit in that chair after what happened. It wasn't the camera, he said, staring into his glass. Not really. I can deal with weird footage. What got me was this feeling, when I watched it back, that whatever was in that seat wasn't just haunting the room. It was trying to do the job. Like it had figured out that this was where people came to watch, and it wanted to see what we saw. That thought stayed with me more than I wanted it to. Because if that was true, then every time I stared into one of those feeds, maybe something on the other side was staring back, not out of malice, not even necessarily out of confusion, but out of a need to understand why we had all this vision now when nobody had been looking the night it mattered. After Ruth brought the old records and told me about Gerald Hobbs, I started digging through the archived incident reports myself. Not because it was part of my job, it wasn't. But by then, the story had its hooks in me. I needed edges, dates, names, something solid enough to hold. Gerald was 26 when he died, married less than a year, no kids, night shift, like us. The report said he was helping guide a trailer into the East Dock during bad weather when miscommunication between the driver and floor crew left him in the wrong place at the wrong second. The trailer backed too far, too fast. There should have been a spotter on the opposite side. There wasn't. By the time anyone realized he was pinned, the steel frame had done what steel does to a human body. The report was clinical. That's what incident reports are built to be. But there was one witness statement included in the file from another worker who said something had always bothered him. He said Gerald never screamed. Not once. He banged against the trailer wall, he hit the dock with his fist, but he never screamed. The witness thought maybe the pain took his breath too fast, or maybe he was trying not to panic the driver while they worked to free him. When I read that, I went back and watched the 12-minute segment again. The first one, the one from the night it all started. This time I wasn't looking at the man. I was looking at his body language, at the way his arms hung, at the slight downward angle of his head before he lifted it toward the camera. And for the first time, I noticed that his right shoulder sat lower than his left. Not by much, just enough to suggest either injury or weight or the kind of posture somebody might hold if one side of their body had been compressed in exactly the wrong way. That was the moment he stopped being, in my mind, just an anomaly. He became a person. Not in the sense that I suddenly wanted to meet him or communicate or open some line between worlds. God, no. But the blank face frightened me less after that than the details around it. The posture, the stillness, the waiting. Because all of those felt recognizably human in a way the distortion itself never had. I think that's why I played the footage again that final night, after the East Dock had already been marked for demolition and everybody else had quietly moved on from the weirdness as best they could. I wanted, stupidly maybe, to see if understanding the history changed anything, to see if by naming him I could also somehow end it. When his mouth moved on that playback and I heard those two words under the hiss, move it, I didn't feel triumph. I felt ashamed, because it meant that all that time, Across all those nights and all those cameras and all those incident logs, the thing I'd been calling a ghost or an anomaly or a presence had maybe just been a man trapped in the same unfinished request for more than 20 years. Move it. Not help me, not get out, not who are you. Move it. The exact thing nobody had done fast enough. I sat there for a long time after the footage ended, and then I did something I have never told anyone from work. I went to the East Dock one last time. Not because I was brave, I wasn't. I think I was just tired of screens, tired of witnessing through glass and static and timestamps, tired of being halfway in every encounter. The dock was empty when I opened the door, cold enough that my breath turned white immediately. Snow crusted the edges of the lot. The floodlight hummed overhead, and for a while I just stood there where the man had stood in the footage, looking at the building from the outside instead of the other way around. Then I said quietly, feeling ridiculous and sincere at the same time, "They moved it." The words vanished into the cold air. Nothing answered, no flicker, no shape, no miraculous release, no cinematic sign that I'd cracked some mystery open at last. Just the ordinary winter noise of a light buzzing and distant traffic muffled by snow. But when I went back inside and checked camera 19, the dock was still empty. It stayed empty the rest of that shift. It stayed empty the next one too, and the one after that, right up until they shut the area down for demolition. Maybe that was coincidence. Maybe the cycle had already run its course. Maybe the system was failing in ways I happened not to see again. I can live with any of those possibilities. What I can't shake is what happened the morning they tore the old pad out. Carla called me from the site because she knew I'd want to hear it. The demolition crew had jackhammered through the concrete and exposed old support metal beneath the dock lip, and wedged in a seam where nobody should ever have found it was a dented brass nameplate from a forklift, half crushed, still readable after all those years. Hobbs. They had to stop work for an hour while somebody from corporate decided whether the find needed to be documented beyond a few photos. In the end, of course, it disappeared into a box, and then into a file, and then probably into nothing. That's what companies do with the physical reminders of old blame. They store them until forgetting becomes easier. But Carla took one of the photos on her phone and sent it to me. I still have that too, next to the copied footage on a drive I keep in the back of a desk drawer at home and almost never look at. People ask me sometimes why I left night work when the pay was decent and I was good at it. I usually tell them the truth people can comfortably accept. Bad sleep, better opportunity, wanted a normal schedule. All of that is true enough. The fuller truth is that once you've seen enough empty rooms on enough screens and learned that empty does not always mean unoccupied, something in the job changes permanently. You stop trusting the calm. You stop believing a camera is just a neutral witness. You start wondering whether, every time a light flickers or a sensor trips with no visible cause, the system is failing or succeeding. I still have the footage. 12 minutes of grainy black and white video that I used to watch because it terrified me. Now I watch it maybe once a year, if that. And what gets me isn't the blank face or the disappearance or even the whispered words at the end. It's the patience of it. The endless, awful patience of someone standing in the one place a camera was finally pointed, waiting for somebody on the other side of the lens to understand what had happened there. And every time I reach the final frame before the cut, I find myself thinking the same thing. Not about Gerald, not even about the building, about all the other places where something happened before there was a camera. All the other hallways and docks and storage units and garages and rooms where the lights were wrong, or the temperature dropped, or the system caught motion in empty space, and everybody who saw it did what we always do: filed it, flagged it, minimized it, moved on. Maybe that's the real reason night shift stories stick with people, because deep down, Everyone knows there are hours of the night when the world feels slightly less finished than it does in daylight, slightly less agreed upon. And in those hours, if a camera shows you something your own eyes can't confirm, you have to decide very quickly which version of reality you're willing to live with. For me, it was never the one on the screen. It was the one waiting just outside the frame. I didn't used to believe security footage could make you sick. I don't mean scared, I mean physically sick. Nausea, headaches, that hollow feeling in your chest like you've just gotten bad news and your body is trying to brace for something. For most of my career, cameras were just tools. You look at them, you log what you see, you move on. They never felt personal. That changed the year I worked nights at the data center. If you've never been inside a commercial data center, imagine a warehouse where instead of shelving and pallets, you've got rows of metal racks loaded with servers and storage arrays, all humming quietly, all blinking their little status lights like insect eyes in the dark. The air never really smells like outside air. It smells like cold metal and recirculated climate control and a faint tang of ozone from all the electronics. I got the job because I'd done night security for years at other sites. They liked that I was comfortable working alone. The pay was better than most warehouse gigs, and they sold it as easy work. Systems handle most of the monitoring, the hiring manager said. You're just there as a physical presence, a pair of eyes in case something goes wrong. There were 3 levels in that building. Ground floor was the lobby, a small control room, and a few offices. Second and third floors were white space, raised floors, rows and rows of racks, hot aisles and cold aisles, everything laid out in neat geometry. Stuffed into those racks were thousands of machines belonging to dozens of companies, all of them trusting this building to keep their data safe. Most nights were as routine as they promised. I'd badge into the control room just before 11, check the handoff notes from the evening staff, and settle in at the main console. The real monitoring happened on the screens in front of me, but the systems were automated. If a temperature rose, or a fan failed, or a drive dropped, the software flagged it. My job was mostly to acknowledge alerts, log them, and call the on-call tech if anything serious came up. The camera grid was almost an afterthought. The system had one dome camera per aisle and a few more covering stairwells and exits. Somebody before my time had set up a rotation of feeds on a side monitor, cycling through the aisles every 30 seconds. I'd glance at it every now and then more out of boredom than expectation. Data centers aren't like malls or hospitals. People don't wander around them at night. If somebody is in an aisle at 3 in the morning, it's either a tech with a badge I already know about or a problem bad enough to trip alarms even without a camera. The first time I felt that sick, hollow sensation was about 3 months into the job. It was a Tuesday night. The weather outside was nothing special. Cloudy, cool, one of those forgettable evenings that feel like filler between more interesting days. The building was quiet except for the murmur of fans behind the walls. I just finished my first walkthrough, a slow circuit from ground floor to third, checking doors and stairwells and making sure the fire extinguishers were where they were supposed to be. Everything looked normal. I was back in the control room, leaning back in the rolling chair, half listening to a podcast, when the side monitor caught my eye. It was showing aisle 3B on the second floor. Just another row of racks, lights blinking, floor tiles gleaming faintly under the cool white overheads. At first, I couldn't tell what had snagged my attention. Then I realized the camera had picked up movement. At the far end of the aisle, just where the hot and cold zones met, something was standing in the center of the row. I say something because even now I struggle to call it a person, and that's not because it didn't look human. It did. It had a human outline, shoulders, arms, head, but the way it stood there was wrong. It wasn't shifted slightly one way or another, the way people do when they're balancing their weight. It was perfectly centered between the racks, like it had been measured and placed exactly in the middle of the aisle. The building's access system keeps a live log of who's in the data floors at any given time. You badge up through the stairwell doors and you badge into each level. The console in front of me showed that I was the only human being in the building at that moment. Nobody else had badged into the second floor since 10:30, when the last evening tech left. I frowned and leaned closer. The feed was good quality, high res, no excuses for muddy detail. From that angle, though, the figure's face was hidden. The camera looked down from the ceiling at the middle of the aisle, catching shoulders and the top of the head. All I could see was dark hair, cut short, and a pale strip of neck. My first thought was that a tech had stayed late and forgotten to sign out. It happens. People get absorbed in work. They lose track of time. But the access system disagreed. No valid badge had opened any door on that floor in over an hour, and the motion alert tied to that aisle camera showed no recent triggers. The system didn't even think anything was moving. I switched the side monitor to manual rotation and pulled up the camera again, full screen. Aisle 3B. The figure was still there, centered, unmoving. I watched for a full 30 seconds. No shift, no tilt of the head, no change in the pattern of rack lights around it. I checked the heat map overlay. One of the tools the engineers used was a thermal visualization that showed general temperature zones on the data floors. It represented warmer areas in red, cooler areas in blue. People in the aisles always showed up as soft orange shapes moving between the racks, little blobs of heat navigating the grid. There was no orange on aisle 3B. The rack tops glowed red where hot exhaust spilled into the hot aisle. The floor tiles in the cold aisle shone blue. The figure between them was nothing, no color, no registration. The thermal system didn't acknowledge that anything solid occupied that space. Even then, I told myself it had to be a glitch. No system is perfect. I checked the nearest adjacent aisle camera, 3A, empty. I checked 3C, empty. When I flipped back to 3B, the figure was still there. It took me a solid minute to realize I was breathing shallow, and my mouth had gone dry. "Hey," I said out loud, not sure who I thought I was addressing. My voice sounded small in the control room. "If you're a tech, you need to badge in." Nothing on the screen changed. No wave, no step forward, no reaction at all. I could have stayed at the console and watched that feed all night. Maybe I should have. Instead, I did what policy says to do when you see anyone in a restricted area the access system doesn't recognize. I got up, grabbed my radio, and went to check physically. The stairwell to the data floors is locked behind a heavy door with a magnetic badge reader. I scanned my card, heard the latch click, and stepped onto the second floor landing. The air there was cooler than on the ground floor, pushed through vents by the crack units humming behind the walls. Even with ear protection, you can feel the sound around you up there, a kind of constant broadband noise that makes silence a memory instead of a reality. I keyed the door for the second floor white space and stepped into the data hall. Overhead lights cast everything in a soft, even glow. The rows of racks stretched away on either side, aisles marked with small placards at eye level: 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B. From where I was, 3B ran straight ahead. I couldn't see the far end of it, just the nearest racks, their fronts studded with status LEDs and cable harnesses. "Second floor," I said into the radio, entering white space, going to check aisle 3B for unauthorized personnel. My voice merged with the fan noise, swallowed almost instantly. No one was on the other end to acknowledge. The on-call engineer was off-site. The only other signal in the building was the little blinking light on the badge reader behind me. I walked. Every step on the raised floor tiles rang just slightly, the hollow sound of metal panels supported by pedestals. The cold aisle on my side felt fine, just a bit chilly. I knew the hot aisle on the far side of each row would feel much more oppressive, hotter air being dumped from the back of the racks. That was the whole design. Cold in front, hot in back. A few aisles in, I turned and stepped between the rows toward 3B. The overheads above that aisle seemed a touch dimmer than the ones I just walked under, though I couldn't tell if that was real or my imagination. The racks on either side glowed with the same busy lights as every other row, little greens and ambers winking in asynchronous patterns. The far end looked empty. "Hello?" I called. "If anyone's in 3B, you need to make yourself visible." Silence, layered over mechanical noise. I walked halfway down, then stopped. The air felt different around me, not hotter or colder, just heavier. Like the atmosphere in that aisle had been packed a little tighter than in the others. It's the kind of sensation you get sometimes before a thunderstorm, when pressure changes in ways you can't quite describe. There was no thunderstorm inside that building, just rows of machines and whatever thoughts they were storing for people miles away. I forced myself to keep going, past one rack, past another. The far end still looked empty. No person standing in the center, no outline, no shadow. When I reached where the figure should have been, according to the camera, I stopped. I knew the precise distance from the camera mount to the rack, the length of the aisle, the angle. I'd measured all that mentally back in the control room. From that data, I knew exactly where it had been standing. There was nothing there. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the row. No one crouching behind a rack. No one pressed against the side of the aisle. My heart was pounding harder than the situation seemed to merit, given what my senses were actually telling me. There was no visible threat, no person, no abnormal noise, but the air still felt wrong. "Control," I said into my radio, habit overtaking logic. "Second floor, 3B clear. No personnel present." I was talking to myself. There was no control staff on duty but me. Still, saying the words helped. It made the room feel more solid, if only for a moment. On the way back to the stairwell, I checked the other aisles visually, just in case. Empty in every direction. No stray techs, no intruders, just racks and their blinking lights. When I re-entered the control room and looked at the camera feed, the figure in aisle 3B was still there. Same position, same posture, same lack of heat signature. I stood in the doorway, staring at the monitor, my mind refusing to reconcile what I'd just seen with what the camera insisted was true. "Okay," I said quietly. "Okay." I sat back down and flagged the segment, recorded everything, timestamps, my movement, the discrepancy between physical inspection and camera view. It was what the job required. For the next 10 minutes, nothing changed. The figure never moved. The system never logged its presence. Eventually, the feed glitched, one small horizontal tear, and when it cleared, the aisle was empty. The figure was gone. Thermal overlay showed nothing out of the ordinary. I told myself I was tired. I told myself some kind of lag had made me and the camera see different moments. I told myself all the things you tell yourself in jobs like that when the system does something you can't explain. And mostly it worked. Until a week later, when the figure showed up again, this time in aisle 2D. Same posture, same non-registration on the thermal map, same absence in the access logs. This time I didn't leave the control room. I watched, I timed, I took notes. It stood there for exactly 11 minutes before the feed glitched and it vanished. The same pattern as before. The third time it appeared on an aisle on the third floor. 11 minutes. Glitch, gone. That number nagged at me. 11 minutes. I tried not to obsess over it. Failed. Eventually I asked one of the day engineers, casually what the emergency response target time was for a major equipment failure on a floor. Oh, you mean like if a crack unit blows or a rack starts really cooking? He said. We aim to get to any aisle in 10 minutes from alarm, 11 in practice, sometimes if we're in the middle of something. 11. The old warehouse report had said it took them 11 minutes to move the trailer off Hobbs. I told myself that was just a recurring number in my life now, a coincidence, a pattern my brain liked because it made chaos feel a tiny bit structured. Then the data center had its own emergency. It happened at 2:47 on a Thursday morning. I remember the time because the alarm cut through the control room like a knife, shrill and immediate, not the soft chime of routine alerts, but the full siren tied to fire suppression and emergency procedures. The main console flashed red. Temperature spike. Third floor. Aisle 5C. The heat map overlay turned that section of the grid bright crimson. Heat rising too fast, too localized for anything normal. I did what training said. I hit the acknowledgement button, logged the time, and grabbed my radio and emergency keyring. I called the on-call engineer. No answer. I tried his backup. Straight to voicemail. Night staff are supposed to sleep with phones near their heads. I don't know where theirs were that night. I badged into the stairwell and took the steps two at a time, heart hammering. The alarm tone echoed faintly up the shaft, a distant wounded sound underneath the constant fan noise. When I opened the door to the third floor white space, hot air hit me like a wall. The building's design isolates heat, but when something goes wrong, that containment can turn against you. A rack with failed fans can dump a lot of heat into a small area fast. Too much heat in an aisle can trigger fire suppression. Fire suppression can be deadly if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. I forced myself to breathe shallow and moved quickly between the racks, following the aisle markers. 3C, 4C, 5C. As I entered 5C, my radio crackled by itself, just static, no voice. The same kind of half sound I'd heard in the warehouse corridor on that storm night. The kind of noise that makes your skin prickle, even though nothing about it is inherently threatening. The heat in that aisle was worse than it should have been. The crack units were pumping cold air, but something was fighting it. I could feel waves of it on my face, like standing too close to a bonfire at a winter party. My eyes went to the top of the racks, looking for smoke. Nothing yet, just heat. Then the aisle camera, mounted overhead, pinged its own alert. Motion detected. On the console downstairs, the feed would have shown exactly where I was standing. On the aisle itself, I saw nothing but racks and tiles and shimmering air. Whoever set the system up did a good job. One of the engineers had told me once, there aren't many blind spots. The cameras see everything important. Except that night, standing in 5C, it felt like the opposite, like the camera was seeing something and I wasn't. I looked down the length of the aisle. For a moment, through the heat distortion, I saw what looked like movement at the far end. Not a person, just a shimmer, like a pocket of hotter air moving against the flow instead of with it. I started walking toward it, slowly. The emergency keyring felt heavy in my hand. The alarm tone pulsed, regular, urgent. I half expected the suppression system to dump at any second, flooding the aisle with gas. Halfway down, my foot hit something soft. I looked down. It was a small stuffed animal, a bear. Dirty around the edges, one button eye hanging by a thread. Somebody had dropped it at some point and it had ended up under the raised floor access panel, kicked loose by vibration or movement, and rolled into the aisle. The fur was old, matted. It didn't belong in a data center. The alarm tone changed then, dropping pitch. My instincts screamed to get out, but something made me look up, just once more, down the aisle toward the far end. The shimmer resolved into a shape. It was in the middle of the row, perfectly centered, just like in 3B, just like in 2D, just like every other time. Human outline, shoulders, head. No orange on thermal, no badge in the system, just presence. This time, though, it wasn't facing the camera mount overhead. It was facing me. I couldn't see its face. The heat distortion blurred everything above the shoulders. But I could feel something in the space between us. The same pressure I'd felt in 3B, amplified by the emergency, by the alarm, by every unresolved incident I'd carried into that building from other jobs. Move it, a voice said. It didn't come from the aisle. It didn't come from the console. It came from my memory, dragged out of the warehouse and dropped into the data center like the universe had decided one unfinished note belonged in another song. 11 minutes, I thought. I turned around and ran. I didn't try to diagnose the rack. I didn't try to be the hero who stops a heat spike by hand. I got out of that aisle and into the stairwell and out of the white space entirely, because all I could think of was a man pinned against steel while everybody scrambled around him doing what they thought was the important work, and how long it had taken anybody to just move the thing killing him. I made it back to the control room in under 2 minutes. The console showed the heat spike beginning to level off. The suppression system had not dumped. The on-call engineer finally called back, voice groggy. By the time he drove in and checked the rack, the problem had resolved itself. A fan had stalled briefly, then restarted. A sensor had spiked, then settled. Nothing had burned. No drives had failed. No data had been lost. He told me I'd overreacted. You did the right thing getting out of the aisle, he said, but you didn't need to panic. The system had it. He was probably right. That's the thing that sticks with me. The system had it. The alert would have happened whether or not I was in the building. The heat would have surged and dipped whether or not anyone stood in 5C at the time. Nothing about my presence changed the outcome. So why had the camera been seeing that figure for weeks beforehand? Why had it been standing in different aisles for exactly 11 minutes each time, always centered, always motionless, always invisible to the thermal overlay? I don't have an answer for that, any more than I have a neat answer for Hobbs on the dock or the corridor outline on the hospital's third floor. All I know is that the pattern broke after that night. I never saw the figure again in any aisle. Not in 3B, not in 2D, not in 5C. The systems kept humming, the racks kept blinking, the cameras kept rotating. The building went back to feeling like a normal data center. I left the job 6 months later for reasons that looked good on paper. Better pay, shorter commute, a position that didn't require me to be awake at 3 in the morning watching screens for signs of ghosts. But there's one small thing I never told the hiring manager at the new site, and one small thing I never mentioned on my exit interview from the data center. The night before I left, I pulled up the camera feeds one more time. Not the live ones, the archive segments. I scrubbed back through a random sampling of aisle footage from the last few weeks. Nothing. No figures, no anomalies. Just racks and lights and long, empty aisles. Then, in the corner of the display, where the thermal overlay color key sits, I noticed the tiniest flicker. The legend, blue for cold, red for hot, orange for human presence, glitched once, for a single frame, and in that isolated instant, the orange mark jumped. It didn't jump into an aisle. It didn't jump onto a rack. It jumped into the little icon at the top of the screen, representing the camera itself. It was a meaningless artifact, a pixel flip. I know that. But sitting alone in that control room for the last time, I remembered Marcus telling me it felt like something in the hub had been trying to do the job, to watch what we watch, to sit where we sit. I remembered the man on the dock, still waiting. I remembered the voice in my memory saying, "Move it." And for the first time, I wondered if maybe whatever these buildings remember doesn't always stay in the halls and aisles. Maybe sometimes it gets curious about the lenses too, about what the cameras see, about what we see. You can call that superstition if you want. You can call it stress or pattern seeking or occupational hazard. I wouldn't argue. All I know is that since then, whenever I walk past a camera, anywhere, I feel a little flicker in my chest, the same way I did when I saw that orange dot hop into the icon for a fraction of a second. It's not fear, exactly. It's awareness. Because once you've spent enough nights in empty buildings and watched enough footage that doesn't line up with what your eyes find, you stop thinking of cameras as just tools. You start wondering who else might be using them from the other side of the glass. That's the thing nobody tells you when you start working nights. It's not just the dark you have to get used to. It's the hours when the world feels a little bit unfinished, when the building is quiet enough that you start noticing patterns nobody wrote into the training manual. The camera that flickers when nothing's moving. The hallway that feels heavier than the others. The motion alert that fires in a room that's supposed to be empty. If you stack enough of those nights together, enough of those little moments when what the system shows you doesn't quite match what your eyes see, you start to understand why some people never stay in the job long. From the outside, it looks simple. One person, a wall of monitors, nothing much happening until the sun comes up. But from the inside, when you're the one sitting there at 3 in the morning, it starts to feel like you're sharing the building with something that doesn't need a badge, doesn't show up on the heat map, and doesn't care if you believe in it or not. Maybe that's all it is. Old stories baked into concrete and steel, replaying themselves whenever the place gets quiet enough. A man waiting on a dock that isn't there anymore. A shadow lying on a hospital floor where the fire alarms once failed. A van that never drove into the garage but still remembers parking there. A storage unit opening and closing on something nobody ever claimed. A figure centered perfectly between server racks, invisible to the sensors that are supposed to see everything. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe buildings just remember the moments when nobody was watching at the 1 second they were needed most. And maybe, once cameras show up, once screens start watching every hallway and aisle, those leftover moments try to finish themselves, over and over, with whoever happens to be awake to see them. I don't know which version of that is true. I don't know if any of it is. I just know that when I finally left night work behind, warehouses, hospitals, garages, storage lots, data centers, I thought I was leaving all of that with it. The static, the glitches, the figures outside the frame. But the last time I sat alone in a control room, on the last night before I turned in my badge for good, I caught my own reflection in the dark glass of a monitor. Just me, tired eyes, fading light behind me, and for a second, a heartbeat too long to be a trick of the fluorescent, my reflection didn't quite move when I did. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just one more artifact in a life full of them. Still, when I turned off the screens and stepped out into the hallway, I nodded once toward the nearest camera, the same way you'd nod to a stranger who'd shared a long night with you without either of you saying anything out loud. Somewhere, in all of those archived feeds and forgotten records and half-erased tapes, those nights are still playing. The dock, the corridor, the garage, the unit door, the aisle, the hub, the rows of server racks, the hours when someone stood exactly where a lens happened to be pointed, waiting for a world that had already moved on. The story ends here. The building is quiet. The monitors are dark. Whatever was watching you watch them has turned away, at least for now. If you're listening to this in the dark, getting ready to sleep, you can let the cameras go for tonight. Let the hallways be just hallways, the doors just doors, the shadows just shadows until morning. And if, sometime after the lights are out, you think you hear a faint chime from a motion sensor or a soft static hiss where there shouldn't be one, you don't have to get up and check. You can just roll over, close your eyes, and tell yourself it's the building remembering something that happened a long time ago when nobody was watching. Because this time, you or I'd be using them from the other side of the glass.